What if I told you there once existed a God as mighty as Yahweh, a divine being of Africa, cloaked in ancient wisdom, strength, and mystery, whose name was deliberately erased from sacred history? Imagine a God who dared to stand against the supremacy of Israel's deity, only to be silenced by time and rewritten scripture. Could it be that the holy texts were altered, reshaped, and cleansed to conceal his existence? Or perhaps, beneath centuries of dust, lie truths powerful enough to unravel everything you were taught in churches, temples, and books of faith. Today we unravel one of the Bible's most forbidden secrets, a mystery that defies reason, shakes theology, and exposes the silence of religion across millennia. This isn't myth or folklore. It's evidence, scattered traces, and ancient records that many hoped would remain forgotten. Why does Scripture speak so deeply of Babylon and Egypt, yet remain silent about the gods of Africa? Why were certain divine names carefully erased from the oldest scrolls? And most provocatively, who was this God that stood face to face with Yahweh? A divine rival? A celestial adversary? Or simply a deity from an African civilization that tradition tried to bury forever? You're about to learn that not all that was sacred stayed written, and that the spiritual story of humankind may be far more African than most will ever admit. What was hidden between the lines could reveal more than the verses themselves. Once you know the truth behind this erased God and the reasons he vanished from Scripture, you may never see the Bible the same way again. So before we descend into the roots of this mystery, take a breath and listen closely. If your beliefs are already trembling, that means you're exactly where you're meant to be. This isn't just a video. It's an awakening, a challenge to everything you've accepted as unshakable truth. Tell me, have you ever heard whispers of an African God lost to time? Who was the God erased from Scripture? Do you believe that ancient knowledge was deliberately silenced to protect a powerful narrative? Share your thoughts in the comments. I read every one of them, and I want to know how this revelation stirs your soul. If you've made it this far, take a second to like the video. It helps the algorithm recognize that this story matters and tells me you want more. Subscribe, turn on notifications, because what's coming next will unveil truths that have been hidden for centuries. Are you ready to see behind the veil? Most people who casually read the Bible think the spiritual world centers only around Israel, Yahweh, and his prophets. But beneath those familiar stories lies another current, quiet, ancient, and powerful, the presence of biblical Africa. When we speak of Africa in Scripture, we aren't just talking about geography. We're talking about divine ancestry, spiritual depth, and civilizations that stood shoulder to shoulder with Israel. Nations that had their own gods, seers, and sacred laws passed down through generations. Take the land of Cush, for instance. It appears time and again in the Bible, a kingdom stretching far beyond modern-day Sudan and Ethiopia. In Genesis, one of the rivers from Eden flowed through Cush, a subtle yet profound sign of its spiritual weight. That wasn't a random reference. Every name written in Scripture carried deep intention. When Africa was mentioned, it was because its influence was known, its power respected, even feared. Ethiopia, too, was seen as a divine realm. The book of Psalms itself proclaims, "Ethiopia shall stretch forth her hands unto God." But why such reverence from Hebrew poets? What sacred force did Ethiopia hold that even Israel recognized its connection to the heavens? This is where we begin to see that far more unfolded along the banks of biblical history than what the canonized texts chose to reveal. And of course, we cannot forget Egypt. Not merely as a biblical antagonist, but as one of the greatest spiritual civilizations ever recorded. Egypt was not merely a civilization. It was a spiritual empire. The Egyptians conversed with divine forces, viewing existence as a reflection of celestial order, mastering the science of the soul, judgment after death, and sacred rites of protection. The Jewish tradition absorbed fragments of these teachings, even as it tried to erase the evidence of such borrowing. Yet beyond Egypt's shadow were forgotten names, deities wiped from every record, banned, forbidden. Among them stood an African, God whose very name was struck from Scripture, venerated by a people whose bond with the unseen world was so powerful that it unsettled the foundations of accepted faith. This being was no demon, no darkness, but a revered power, honored and, according to surviving fragments, even feared by the Israelites. Imagine the storm this truth would unleash. Discovering Yahweh was not the sole figure to command awe and devotion that another equal in might had been deliberately erased. Such a revelation challenges the core of belief, forcing minds to break free from sacred comfort. Yet this confrontation is vital, for to uncover divine truth, one must face what history buried. The apocryphal writings, texts cast aside by councils, hold fragments of that hidden world. Books like Enoch, Jubilees, and the Dead Sea Scrolls whisper of luminous beings beyond Israel's heavens, of forgotten powers ruling nations long before Abraham's birth. And here lies the most delicate truth. Many of those powers were African. Civilizations like Nubia, southern Canaan, and ancient Egypt spoke of this god not as myth, but as a living, commanding spirit. Oral legends, sacred carvings, and relics from the Nile to Ethiopia testify to a faith that endured in silence, a devotion to a God of justice, flame, battle, and wisdom. Paradoxically, these were the same divine attributes Israel ascribed to Yahweh at his most fearsome. And here lies perhaps the most unsettling revelation. Some researchers, both theological and secular, suggest that certain biblical names labeled as demons or impure spirits might actually be distorted echoes of that ancient African god. To erase its memory, they had to twist reverence into fear, holiness into blasphemy, turning a deity once loved into a force to be shunned. History has shown this pattern countless times, especially when the divine wore the face of Black or indigenous heritage. It's always the same transformation. When an ancestral power threatens established order, it is demoted from god to idol, from idol to spirit of darkness, until it vanishes from the pages of Scripture but not from the hearts of the people. That is why, even today, across parts of Africa and the Caribbean, clandestine brotherhoods still honor this divine flame. They may no longer call him by the same name or use the same ancient rites, yet the spirit remains. The same pulse that once set sacred fires ablaze long before the missionaries came. What many dismiss as syncretism may, in truth, be guardianship of spiritual memory, a resilience that no empire could extinguish. Perhaps, just perhaps, this video is awakening in you a question long buried, that what the world once called heresy might actually be the doorway to reclaiming your true spiritual lineage. This is not about rebellion. It is about revelation. For when you grasp that the divine cannot be confined to a single path, you begin to see that the human soul was made for communion far deeper than dogma ever allowed. And you, are you ready to know the forbidden name? To hear the echo that once roared through Cush's hills, Egypt's sands, and Ethiopia's rivers? Are you prepared to touch a secret that could shift your entire understanding of the spiritual realm? If your spirit stirs as you listen, type in the comments. Truth cannot be erased. And if you've heard whispers of an African divinity that haunts your curiosity, share it below. Your words might awaken another soul. Stay with me, because what follows reveals who this God truly was, the one who dared to stand before Yahweh, powerful enough to make scribes tremble, and theologians silence his name forever. To uncover why this deity was erased, we must abandon the narrow, westernized lens through which most people interpret African spirituality. Set aside the old notions of paganism and superstition, for what we're exploring here is not myth but a genuine divine force, honored by civilizations that thrived for millennia. These were cultures guided by sacred codes, moral discipline, and a spiritual intelligence equal to any known faith. According to fragments that survive the purge of history, this god bore a name once whispered among the high priests of Cush and the sages of Ethiopia, a name spoken with awe and trembling, believed to hold both the origin of creation and the law of divine justice. He wasn't merely a local spirit. He was the heartbeat of a nation, a protector and purifier, the consuming flame of righteousness who defended the pure and punished the corrupt. His name was sung in battle chants and whispered in ceremonies of life and death. His essence was summoned through harmonic songs, intricate symbols, and carvings etched into sacred stone, marks still dismissed by many archaeologists today. Nile legends tell that this god once walked among mortals, not as a beast but as a radiant being whose brilliance made eyes turn away in reverence. Depictions described him as a man of luminous black skin, with breath as warm as the desert winds of the Sahara. Some swore he spoke every language in existence. Others said his voice alone could bring warriors to their knees. He embodied the sovereignty of Africa across the unseen realms, a divine teacher of balance, honor, and the rhythm of nature's eternal cycle. Strangely, his qualities mirror many of the traits the Bible later ascribed to Yahweh: fire that devours, thunderous voice, all-seeing gaze, presence that inspires awe. Coincidence? Unlikely. The Semitic and African worlds shared constant spiritual exchanges, their divine ideas blending, colliding, and at times competing. Yet as Yahweh's supremacy was enshrined in Hebrew tradition, this god was deliberately muted, perhaps because his existence endangered the control the scribes wished to preserve. Unlike the grand temples of Egypt, his followers worshipped under the open sky, at circular altars surrounded by nature's elements, where every flame and shadow still whispered his forbidden name. His worship was always intertwined with the rhythm of nature itself. Fire embodied his justice, water reflected his wisdom, the earth symbolized his loyalty, and air carried the breath of his unseen spirit. His followers, both men and women, stood as equals, serving as priests and priestesses with the same divine authority. That alone was revolutionary, defying the patriarchal order of neighboring faiths that silenced the feminine voice. In their ceremonies, there was no bloodshed, no slaughtered offerings, only songs, dances, and the fragrance of sacred herbs rising into the night. They believed this deity rejoiced in the vibration of honesty, the rhythm of pure intention, the music born from the soul. His doctrine did not command fear, it invited connection. Every human, they taught, carried a spark of his essence, and the purpose of life was to awaken that light and align with the harmony of the cosmos itself. Does this not echo the Genesis idea of humanity made in God's image? Could traces of this ancient belief have slipped quietly into the roots of Judeo-Christian tradition? Legends say this god appeared to the wise through dreams, visions, and even mysterious natural signs. Elders spoke of lightning that descended from the heavens, scorching sacred patterns into the soil, of disembodied voices echoing through empty deserts, of wild beasts bowing their heads during rituals. To skeptics, these are myths, but what if they are remnants of encounters too sacred to be recorded openly? When compared to other Semitic deities, something remarkable stands out. He was never lesser. In truth, his presence was more enlightening, more spiritual, more compassionate. While Moloch demanded blood and Baal wielded storms of domination, this African god represented balance, clarity, and justice. He sought not pain, but awareness. He ruled not by terror, but through wisdom. And for a system built on submission and fear, such divinity was simply too dangerous to be allowed to survive. A god who awakens humanity instead of enslaving it. A god who empowers rather than dominates. That alone made him dangerous. Perhaps that's why his name was deliberately erased from sacred memory. Maybe the ancient scribes chose to disguise him, labeling him a foreign spirit or reducing him to a mere idol among Israel's neighbors. It would explain why certain divine names flash briefly in old genealogies before vanishing altogether. Why lands once revered by Africans later became branded as cursed. The erasure was not only physical, it was symbolic. To erase his name was to erase identity. To silence memory was to sever the people from their own spiritual roots. Yet memory endures. It breathes in the rituals of remote villages, in the whispered prayers of elders, in the songs sung in dying tongues beneath starlit skies. And maybe, just maybe, he is resurfacing now, through your curiosity, through your hunger to question, through that stirring inside you that refuses to accept what's on the surface. The spirit of truth cannot be buried forever. If this is awakening something in you, if it's making you reflect in ways you never have before, write it in the comments. Say, I seek the forgotten truth. And if you've ever heard of an African god whose name the Bible omitted, mention it below. You might help others searching for the same revelation. Because what's coming next will shake your understanding even more. Now that you've glimpsed the essence of this veiled divinity, this ancient African god revered across generations, we must face a deeper mystery. Why did he oppose Yahweh? Why, among all gods of the old world, was it this one who became the target of erasure, silence, and spiritual exile? The answer lies hidden between the folds of Scripture and the invisible wars that shaped the history of belief. This was not a simple clash of cultures. It was a cosmic confrontation with theological ripples that still echo through religion today. What most people fail to see is that the Bible's narrative doesn't unfold in a spiritual void. The ancient world it describes was a vast battlefield of celestial beings, forces radiating light, wisdom, and command. Within this landscape, Yahweh wasn't the sole divine presence. He reigned as the God of Israel, true, yet other nations with deep, advanced spiritual traditions also believed they communed with the sacred. Among them existed this African deity whose very name was erased from memory, one who not only existed beside Yahweh, but boldly stood as a spiritual voice before him. But what did this defiance mean? Was it a divine rivalry, a battle of egos, a struggle between darkness and light as we've long been told? Or was it something far more profound, a confrontation between dominance and awareness, between forced enlightenment and awakened wisdom? His rebellion wasn't about war, it was about meaning. It was spiritual, philosophical. While Yahweh demanded total allegiance, gathering worship around himself, this other god encouraged free thought, spiritual self-reliance, and a direct link to the essence of being. In simpler terms, where Yahweh declared, "I alone am God," this African deity whispered, "You too carry the spark of the divine. We exist in turbulent times, when prophecy unfolds before our eyes, yet many fail to see what's truly happening. That's why I created my digital book, Reveal the Apocalypse, which you can access instantly via the first pinned comment. Inside, you'll uncover the hidden meanings of the apocalypse and awaken your understanding forever. Don't delay. Get your copy now before it's gone. Click the link and secure it today. Imagine what this contrast meant. One society living under fear, rituals, and rigid law, while another learned that holiness lived within, that communion with the Creator required no mediator, that the way to divinity was inward, individual, and above all, free. Naturally, this spiritual ideology posed a direct challenge to the theocratic order that Yahweh embodied within Israel's religious framework. That's where the real confrontation began, not on battlefields but within the unseen realms of ancient spiritual thought. Hidden scriptures and oral traditions passed down through African tribes tell of visions in which this African deity defied imposed doctrines, declaring that divine truth could not be confined to one nation or one sacred name, that there were countless paths to enlightenment, and that heaven itself belonged to no single people. For the Hebrew worldview, this was unbearable, for Yahweh's covenant thrived on exclusivity. "I am the Lord your God who brought you out of Egypt. You shall have no other gods before me." That statement, in essence, was a declaration of war against all alternate forms of faith. But what occurs when another divine being, carrying his own legacy, culture, and followers, rises before the celestial throne and says, "I am not your foe, but I will not bow"? That is no mere act of rebellion. It is the breaking of a paradigm. This defiance was quickly branded as heresy, defilement, and spiritual treason. And in the theological world of the ancient Near East, tolerance was non-existent. You either submitted or vanished. Remember, too, to secure your digital copy of Reveal the Apocalypse while it's still available. Stocks are limited, so act fast before it disappears. The paradoxes grow deeper when we study the sacred symbols born from this clash, light and shadow. In numerous African traditions, darkness isn't evil. It is the womb of creation. It's within the night that life stirs, the seed awakens, and wisdom breathes in silence. Light represents revelation, but also exposure. Harmony between the two is divine. Yet in Hebrew doctrine, darkness came to signify sin, emptiness, and separation from God. This inversion demonized entire systems of belief that saw darkness as holy. Thus, an African god with obsidian skin, worshipped under moonlit skies through quiet midnight rites, would soon be marked as dangerous, even though he never was. He never caused harm. Yet this is the essence of rebellion's paradox. When a being refuses to kneel before a single definition of faith, he is instantly marked as a traitor. But is defiance always wicked? Or can some revolts rise from the need to protect a sacred truth being suffocated by dogma? The defiance of this African deity might not have been aimed at Yahweh himself, but at humanity's arrogance. The desire to confine the divine to one shape, one title, one rigid belief. Here lies the heart of the matter. Was his name erased because he rivaled Yahweh? Or because he threatened the hierarchy that ruled through religion? A God who tells his followers you are free to think, to feel, to seek truth within, dissolves the grip of those who govern by fear disguised as faith. That, more than any heavenly dispute, explains why countless gods were deleted from the story. This conflict never unfolded on earthly battlefields. It happened in shadows of ink and fire. No armies, only councils. No swords, only decisions on what to keep, what to burn, which names to hide beneath translations, and which scrolls to bury forever. And at the center stood one defiant voice, an African god who whispered, "I exist too." Now, after centuries of silence, that voice stirs again. It lives in the curiosity of those watching, in the quiet unease of seekers who sense there's more beyond tradition, in the thirst for truth that refuses to fade. Deep inside, we all wonder, have we really heard the full story? Is the Bible as we know it truly the complete revelation of the divine, or a framed fragment of something infinitely larger? If this message awakens something in you, a spark, a question long ignored, share it below. Speak your truth. Remember, not all rebels are enemies of God. Some are guardians of forgotten light. Stay close, because in the next chapter, we'll journey into a realm even deeper, one that has remained hidden from humanity for far too long. Now that we've unraveled the spiritual and theological tension between Yahweh and this veiled African presence, a new question rises. If this entity was truly so powerful, so deeply rooted in cultures neighboring Israel, how did its name vanish from memory? Was it really erased without a trace, or is it still hidden in plain sight, woven between verses, coded within metaphors, waiting for awakened eyes to uncover what organized faith has long buried? The truth begins to shimmer when we examine the scriptures not with dogmatic lenses, but with curiosity. Certain verses seem strangely detached, cryptic mentions of forces, obscure names, and foreign gods that briefly appear and then fade into silence. Why would a sacred text reference mysterious beings only once, offering no story, no explanation, as if the reader should already understand? Or perhaps as if the writer wanted to reveal without daring to expose. One striking case lies in the ancient passage describing the sons of God descending to unite with the daughters of men. Who were these celestial visitors? Angels, as tradition claims, or divine entities that once walked among humans, later rewritten as rebels to fit a single truth? Some researchers suggest that this Genesis fragment may be a distorted echo of African divinities tied to fertility, creation, and the sacred lineage of humankind. Another clue hides in Isaiah's cryptic phrase, "the mighty one of Cush," a title translators often glide over. Was the prophet describing a mortal ruler, or subtly alluding to a divine force revered beyond the Nile? The repeated invocation of glory, strength, and awe in relation to Cush seems deliberate. Could this have been the hidden shadow of a god whose name was too dangerous to record? Throughout Psalms and the prophets, we find whispers: gods of distant lands, spirits of the desert, powers of the south, hidden forces beyond the Nile. These phrases are not random. They are remnants, the ghost fingerprints of an erased divinity. The Bible's margins, if read with spiritual intuition, may still carry the echo of the one they tried to silence. And perhaps the most fascinating detail of all, these references are never directly denied. They are simply bypassed, dismissed, or conveniently labeled as mystery. Yet one case stands apart. In the book of Ezekiel, the prophet constantly speaks of Egypt and neighboring African realms being judged by Yahweh, but his warnings are not about ordinary idolatry. He describes spiritual arrogance, hidden sanctuaries, and sacred serpents that dared to rise against divine light. This was more than ritual defiance. It was an open spiritual challenge powerful enough to threaten the theological supremacy of Israel's God. What exactly did Ezekiel witness in those lands? Why such unease? What ancient rites could provoke heaven's judgment so deeply? Then come the silenced scriptures, the apocryphal books, censored in councils or left scattered in fragments. The book of Enoch tells of celestial watchers who descended to teach humanity, only to be condemned for their compassion. Yet these beings, though punished, are portrayed as bearers of sacred knowledge, keepers of nature's harmony, and some of their traits mirror the African divinity we've been uncovering. Guardian, wise, unbowed before the throne, but never evil. The pattern is clear. Every time a divine presence emerged that did not conform to Yahweh's hierarchy, not dark but independent, it was buried, renamed, or turned into a warning. Still, the traces remain like footprints left in shifting desert sands, and when we follow them, a picture emerges. This African god was mentioned, not by name, not openly, but as a veiled force, a spiritual echo threatening the myth of a single, absolute deity. Even the Song of Deborah, one of the oldest hymns in Hebrew scripture, whispers of gods from the south who brought heat, wind, and revelation. The South, though long synonymous with Africa, is portrayed as a source of divine manifestation. These deities were not metaphors. They were present, active, and real. So why, after all these centuries, does no one dare to speak of them? Why is it that, despite countless theological studies, these ancient verses are still dismissed as mere poetic metaphors, stripped of any doctrinal weight? The silence is not ignorance, it's intention. What we are uncovering here is not fantasy, but the careful decoding of a text meticulously edited to protect certain truths and bury others. The trace of the African god within Scripture is faint, yet undeniable. It lingers in fragments, in echoes, in spaces where meaning was cut away. It breathes through unnamed spirits of the southern lands, through the vanishing names, through the altars swallowed by desert sands. Perhaps now you too begin to realize, the Bible is divine, yes, but it is also historical. Edited, molded by the hands of men with motives. Once we accept that, the pages transform. The words start to speak between the lines, and what was once hidden begins to whisper from the shadows of the text. If this message resonates in your soul, if any of these ancient passages suddenly make sense in a way they never did before, write in the comments, "I saw between the lines." That single phrase will tell me, and others, that you are beginning to perceive the unseen. And if you recall any strange verse, any name that felt out of place or veiled in mystery, share it below. Together we are piecing together a sacred puzzle that has been scattered for centuries. But don't leave yet. What comes next will pierce even deeper through the veil of time. Because now that we've uncovered the surviving traces of this entity in holy text, we must confront one of the most unsettling revelations of all. His name was not lost by accident. It was erased intentionally by the very men who decided which truths the world was allowed to keep. And that realization is among humanity's deepest spiritual wounds. To learn that our sacred history was written with omissions, with edits, with acts of deliberate silence. Yes, this African god's name was extracted from scripture, but before it vanished, it thundered in temples, echoed in chants, and was whispered by priests who felt his fire of justice and his breath of wisdom. He was never a minor figure. He was a living force, a name that inspired awe and dread in equal measure. Yet over time, that very name became too threatening, too disruptive, too immense to coexist with the tidy narrative that would later dominate centuries of faith. And so a moment came when certain men clothed in sacred power, chose that this name must vanish. It was to be forgotten, erased from every tongue and every text. But who were these men who claimed the authority to decide what could be called divine and what must be condemned as heresy? Who granted them the right to shape heaven's voice? When we look closely at how the biblical canon was built, we uncover not holiness alone but politics, rivalry, and ideology. Councils were held, debates raged, agendas clashed. Every book chosen or rejected was not only a product of revelation, but of influence, spiritual, cultural, and even military. Any name that challenged the supremacy of the God of Israel, or opened doors to other interpretations of the sacred, was instantly marked as dangerous, branded heretical, and buried beneath silence. It was a violent cleansing. The names of African deities and divine entities once honored by peoples who lived beside the Hebrews for generations simply vanished. Sometimes they survived only as faint traces, a cryptic line, a shadow of a verse. Other times they were wiped so completely that their existence became legend. Yet they lived, worshipped, feared, and fiercely resisted by religious orders that sought to claim sole ownership of the divine truth. This was more than textual censorship. It was spiritual amputation. To remove those names was to strip humanity of its right to question, to explore, to see the divine from more than one angle. Ordinary believers were confined within a single story, a single image of God. Everything beyond that boundary was condemned as idolatry, paganism, or evil. And even now you can still hear that echo, in sermons, in fear, in prejudice. African spirituality, or any path outside the Judeo-Christian mold, remains cast as darkness. This is the long shadow of that ancient erasure, a censorship that began in Scripture and still dwells within the human mind. But why such terror at a mere name? Because names are not just sounds. They are frequencies, vibrations of power that awaken what history tried to silence. A name is more than sound, it is identity, essence, and code. It is a key capable of unlocking unseen realms. When a name is spoken with faith and reverence, it opens a door between the human and the divine. The ancients understood this deeply. That is why Yahweh's name was guarded so carefully, written only in consonants, forbidden to be uttered aloud. But the name of this African deity followed another fate. It was not concealed out of sacred devotion. It was buried out of fear. Fear that the people would awaken. Fear that they would realize divinity is not confined to temples or scrolls. That the spirit could also rise from a drumbeat, a ritual dance, a chant whispered in the language of ancestors. That was the true danger. The idea that humanity could once again commune with the divine without priests, intermediaries, or doctrine. And so the question echoes, who truly holds the authority to label something as heresy? Who dares to condemn an ancient spiritual lineage and call it evil? By what measure do we separate the holy from the forbidden? The truth is often unsettling. What cannot be controlled by power must be silenced. Heresy, in many cases, is simply independence, the act of speaking to the divine without permission. This leads to a painful yet necessary reflection. Could some of the figures branded in the Bible as demons or unclean spirits actually have been revered beings from other cultures, deliberately recast into darkness? History is filled with such transformations. The gods of one people become the monsters of another. When religion joins hands with power, its first act is to erase competing voices. It rewrites the sacred code, paints over altars, and burns names. Yet true spiritual memory never dies. You cannot drown it with ink or destroy it with flame. It lingers, in dreams, in visions, in the whispered stories that survive from parent to child, from age to age. After centuries of silence and censorship, the name of this African god still breathes in the hidden corners of the world. It vibrates through ancestral chants, hums within the wind that crosses deserts, and whispers through the trees of ancient forests. It beats in the hearts of those who refuse to believe that divine truth could ever be confined within the pages of a single book. The Bible is sacred, yes, but it is not the sole voice of God. And that is why stories like this matter. Because they rekindle forgotten questions. They break the locks placed on human thought. They restore the sacred right to seek, to feel, to remember. If you are still here listening, it is because something within you recognizes this call, an echo older than history itself. It comes from a time when spirituality was not read but lived, when feet touched the soil and the heartbeat itself was a prayer, when the sacred was not trapped in text, but pulsed in the invisible fabric of creation. If these words stirred something inside you, if you felt a vibration awaken deep within, then leave your mark. Comment, "I want to remember what they tried to make me forget." That phrase will be your spiritual key, your way of saying, "I see beyond the veil, but do not go yet," because the next revelation will shake the ground beneath you. What comes now takes us into the forbidden, into the texts that were buried, burned, or banished for being too truthful. They were not silenced because they lied, but because they revealed too much. Among them stands one of the most feared and mysterious writings in human history, the Book of Enoch. A text outlawed, cursed, and erased by religious councils that knew exactly how much power it contained. And it is within these forbidden pages that the link between Enoch and the forgotten African god begins to surface. Because Enoch is not just another apocryphal work, it is a key, a spiritual cipher that unlocks what was edited, twisted, and hidden from the sacred narrative we were taught to accept. Unlike the canonical scriptures, Enoch speaks without fear, of celestial beings who refused subservience, of divine messengers who descended to earth, who shared sacred wisdom with humankind, and who dared to walk alongside us rather than above us. Unlike the laws of the temple or the codes of Moses, these celestial beings acted without any mediator. They are called watchers, guardians of the threshold between heaven and earth. Among them were leaders, chiefs, and radiant entities whose names appear nowhere else in the official scriptures. In the Book of Enoch, however, they are given depth and dignity, portrayed not as devils but as divine spirits who chose dissent over obedience. They chose to teach, to love, to awaken humanity, and for that they were condemned. But what connects all of this to the African god? Everything. Because hidden between Enoch's verses lies the echo of a being who refused to kneel, not from pride but from devotion to a higher cause, freeing humankind from ignorance. A being who believed that enlightenment was not the right of priests or kings, but the birthright of all souls. A teacher who descended to walk among men, to guide, to reveal, to lift the veil from their eyes. And in doing so, he defied the spiritual empire that demanded silence. What if this entity was never an angel at all? What if he was an ancestral god once worshipped in Cush in Ethiopia, in the sacred land south of Israel, later disguised in the scriptures as one of the Watchers, his divinity softened and rebranded for theological comfort? That would explain why his name vanished from the canon, yet lingers powerfully through the forbidden texts. Why his mission of light was rewritten as rebellion, why his compassion was called heresy. In the Book of Enoch, these celestial guides are said to have revealed to mankind the hidden mechanisms of the cosmos, the rhythm of stars, the medicine of plants, the language of creation, the science of the soul. But why would enlightenment be condemned? Why would teaching be branded as sin? Because knowledge liberates, and a liberated people cannot be ruled through fear. They cannot be manipulated by guilt or controlled by dogma. That is where the sacred meets the political, where divine truth threatens earthly power. What was labeled forbidden was not evil, it was merely untamed truth. From the Book of Jubilees to the Apocalypse of Abraham, and even fragments preserved among the Dead Sea Scrolls, a different spiritual tapestry begins to form, one woven from voices that existed alongside Yahweh's story. Within this vast mosaic, divinity takes many shapes. The unnamed African god appears quietly between the lines, his essence reflected in gestures and ancient rituals, in the luminous missions of forgotten celestial beings. The consequences of recognizing this are profound, because to accept these texts as partially true is to admit that humanity's spiritual history was only half told, that whole chapters are missing, chapters rich in rhythm, color, ancestry, and African soul. It means that revelation did not only descend from the heavens but also rose from the earth itself, from the rivers of Ethiopia, from the golden highlands of Cush, from the shadowed groves where priests sang to heal both body and spirit. This is why the suppression of these writings was so deliberate. They weren't ignored by accident, they were hunted, silenced, labeled as dangerous. But dangerous to what? To the truth or to the power of those who built their authority on selective memory? The unease deepens when we realize that this suppression endures even now. Few pastors mention the Book of Enoch. Few churches invite their people to read it. Few seminaries dare to analyze its hidden depth. Why? Because its words awaken too much. They stir memory. They call forth the echo of an older, freer, and more living form of spirituality, a faith that didn't need translation because it was experience, and this is what many feel when they finally encounter these forbidden scriptures, a strange mixture of recognition and discomfort that is actually the birth of remembrance. It's the moment when the spirit recalls what centuries of fear tried to bury. That lost vibration now begins to rise again, slowly, like an ancestral drumbeat beneath the silence. If you are hearing these words and something within you stirs, you have already joined this reawakening. You are touching an ancient current that surpasses religion, transcends time, and restores what was once torn apart. You are remembering. If something within you whispers, "I've always known this truth without ever learning it," then right below, "Truth calls me by name." And if you've ever explored the Book of Enoch or any other forbidden scriptures, share your encounter. Which passage struck your soul the hardest? Which part challenged your beliefs the most? Your comment could ignite another person's spiritual awakening. And be prepared. What comes next dives even deeper. Now that we've unveiled what was hidden in ancient pages, it's time to see how it reshapes your faith and your present world. Through the ages, the echoes of this erasure were not limited to torn scrolls or lost verses. They flowed through generations like unseen scars on the spirit. These invisible wounds have long wounded the spiritual identity of African descendants in modern times. The deliberate forgetting of this African deity, the silencing of his rituals, the demonization of his traditions, and the rejection of his divine energy left profound scars on ancestral memory. Maybe that's why many today still feel something missing in their faith, a gap they cannot name, but one that burns like a live ember inside their chest. How often have black believers filled church pews, listened to fiery sermons, lifted their voices in praise, and still walked away with emptiness inside? That emptiness isn't faithlessness, it's the absence of identity. Because they were taught to love God, yet conditioned to despise every trace of their own beginning, they were told to fear the drumbeat, condemn the dancer, silence the ancestral tongue, distrust their skin, their rhythm, their sacred power. Everything born of Africa was cast as shadow, profane, suspicious, impure, as if God's light had skipped an entire continent, and that distortion tore a wound deep into the spirit. For how can faith be whole when it demands you to disown yourself? When it asks you to sever your roots just to reach the divine, this is where the erasure of the African God stops being history. It becomes a living wound still bleeding within the walls of religion today. Many have been taught to ignore or even despise everything tied to their African ancestry. And when a people are cut off from the spiritual essence that anchors their identity, they become exposed. Exposed to manipulation, to oppression, to quiet submission under doctrines crafted to mute their voice. The forgotten God symbolized more than rituals or worship. He embodied spiritual liberty. He stood for self-sovereignty, the divine right to hear God without intermediaries, without the approval of temples or hierarchies, without bending beneath a theology that never accepted him as holy. To remember this God is, above all, to reclaim the spiritual dignity of African people, and that remembrance shakes foundations. It threatens systems. It restores power. It rekindles a connection too ancient, too alive to ever be tamed again. In our time, a quiet yet unstoppable awakening is unfolding. Young black men and women beginning to question the very soil from which their faith was shaped. Black women gazing at their hair, their movement, their ways of celebrating life, and asking, why were we taught to feel shame for what our ancestors called sacred? Black men opening the scriptures only to discover that the spirituality they inherited had been filtered, stripped of everything that reflected their true origin. And this awakening, it is not rebellion. It is remembrance. It is sacred. It is revolutionary. When the spirituality of African descent reconnects with its roots, it does not replace the gospel. It deepens it. It amplifies it. It gives faith back its heartbeat. It restores humanity's image before the divine, not as slaves trembling before a master, but as complete beings, radiant with the Creator's likeness, a child of light who never needed to erase his history to be embraced by his Father. And that, perhaps, is the greatest inheritance this erased African God still offers us, the reminder that we were divine long before we learned to utter the name Yahweh. Yet, such truth is not easily embraced. Many still resist. Many still turn away. Many remain paralyzed by fear. Fear of asking questions, fear of being branded heretics, fear of losing their place in the congregations they've always called home. Yet that is precisely why we are here, because fear can no longer be allowed to govern the soul of a people. The moment has come to mend what was broken, with truth, with bravery, with listening, and above all, with reconnection. This is not a call to abandon faith. It is a call to restore it, to make it whole again, to reconcile with the fragments of the self once condemned as sin when they were, in truth, sacred inheritance. In many African villages, even among those who long embraced Christianity, traces of that ancient divinity still breathe. Songs echo like ancestral invocations. Baptisms performed in rivers recall the ancient rites of water initiation. Prayers rise in circles, with rhythm, with hands, with movement, with voice. These are not mere fusions of old and new. They are acts of spiritual defiance, seeds that refuse to die, memories that kept glowing even beneath the frost of Eurocentric theology that sought to replace fire with routine and spirit with ritual. The truth is unshakable. The Spirit of God has never been caged. And that is why it still moves freely among the sons and daughters of Africa. When these children turn inward and find within themselves a divine flame, one not learned in Sunday school, but pulsing fiercely in the heartbeat of the drum, something shifts. Prayer deepens. Scripture opens like new sky. Worship stops mimicking and becomes revelation. This is how erasure begins to fade, when someone chooses to remember When someone dares to question, when someone finally listens to the whisper that says, "You too are a temple. You too are an altar. You too are sacred ground." And that is why messages like this exist, not to deliver all the answers, but to spark the return, to reopen the path, to awaken the healing. If these words stirred something deep within you, if your spirit trembled, your heart raced, or your eyes grew wet, then leave your mark. Write in the comments, "I am remembering me." That simple phrase carries power. It declares that your soul is awakening, that you are walking this path with us. And if you know someone whose heart longs to hear this message, share it, because this movement of spirit only breathes when it moves together, and together, our awakening is just beginning. Now the journey must continue, toward a question rarely spoken aloud, yet one that waits in the silence of every soul. After hearing of erased names, forbidden texts, hidden spirits, and memories buried beneath centuries of fear, we arrive at a crossroad no one can avoid. What truly defines the sacred? And more importantly, who decides what counts as revelation and what is condemned as heresy? For generations, we were taught to believe that everything between the Bible's covers was final, complete, untouchable. That to question was to sin, to explore beyond was to wander from the path. To listen to ancient voices was to stray from salvation. But what if that path was built with missing stones? What if only fragments of truth were handed to us, carefully chosen to preserve control? This is the quiet wound of organized spirituality. It preaches that holiness has one form, that divine truth fits in a single script, that only one voice speaks for God. But this narrow lens has exiled millions, souls who feel guilty for their intuition, ashamed of their heritage, doubtful of their own divine callings. Many carry powerful spiritual gifts, deep perception, ancestral connection, but we're taught to see them as error, temptation, or darkness. And so a people were severed from their spiritual roots, cut off from their original essence. Why must the sacred always resemble what Europe has declared holy? Why do most icons of faith bear pale faces, dressed in foreign robes framed by climates and cultures that never birthed them? Why has the divine been whitewashed, polished, and standardized until it no longer mirrors the soil, the sun, and the spirit that first gave it life? Who then granted the authority to reshape heaven in one image and erase all others? Why were we taught to believe in a Jesus with blue eyes instead of the unpainted Jesus, the one born under the blazing sun, among people of brown skin and oral tradition? What is heresy really? Is it rebellion? Or is it simply the act of asking, of seeking what lies beyond, of listening to the elders whose voices carry the echo of our forgotten lineage? What if that God erased from Scripture was not an enemy of heaven, but another face of the same Spirit we call holy today? If, as Christ said, the Spirit of God moves wherever it wills, then why could it not have moved through the forests of Angola, along the sacred hills of Ethiopia, on the banks of the Nile, among priests who danced barefoot in the dust, calling the divine through song, through rhythm, through fire? Revelation cannot be imprisoned in ink. A book is only a snapshot, but God is motion, breath, infinity. And when we shut the window to that sacred wind, what remains is not revelation. It is religion, rigid and breathless. Heresy, then, is often not about seeking too far. It is about refusing to see. And those who most loudly condemn what they do not understand may, without realizing it, be rejecting living fragments of divine truth itself. Because the Spirit never spoke one language alone. It sang in ancestral dialects. It moved in rhythm and dance. It still speaks in symbols the world has forgotten. Yet the heart still remembers. Who then gave authority to define what is sacred? Who decided that one people's prayer could be called holy, while another's was dismissed as superstition? The same system that erased the name of the African god also silenced the voices of those who sang to him. But now at last, you are hearing them again. You can feel the weight of that silence breaking. You can sense that your faith to be whole again must be rebuilt with the pieces they tried to hide. And the most powerful truth of all? This is not heresy. This is freedom. This is remembrance. This is the Spirit returning to its source. This is the moment of reconnection, a return to our true essence. Many are realizing today that the sacred cannot be confined to one image or shape. It beats within us, revealing itself in the smallest moments, living both in our doubts and in our faith. And this awakening unlocks doors long sealed by guilt, fear, and spiritual control. But now you hold the key. Because where there is honest seeking, revelation always follows. Where the soul thirsts sincerely, it is always quenched. And when we dare to confront what was once hidden, we find freedom. Revelation didn't end with Scripture. It continues through you in your heart, in the memories of your spirit, in your unfiltered link with the divine. A connection that asks for no validation, no doctrine, no permission. It belongs only to you, real and pure. So let me ask with full honesty, what if the things you were taught to call heresy were actually truth revealed? And what if the truths you were told to obey were only systems of control? Who would you be if you had been taught that divinity also lives within your color, your roots, your ancestors? That the forgotten God was never an enemy of Yahweh, but another reflection of the same sacred breath speaking a different tongue? If these words moved you, and if something within trembled, wept, or simply grew silent, let that feeling remain. Leave your mark below. Right, and they only told me half the truth. Those words unite you with every soul awakening to a faith no longer shaped by fear, but reborn through freedom. And share this with someone who needs to remember who they are, who must break free from guilt and rediscover divine revelation, because what comes next may forever change how you see the Bible and your place within it. If you made it this far, take a deep breath, for only those brave enough to journey till the end are ready for what's ahead. What you feel right now is the beginning of a deeper awakening. That feeling alone already reveals so much about who you are. So listen closely. Hit that subscribe button, not as a routine click, but as a sacred act of commitment. Commitment to truth, to wisdom, to the spiritual roots that run through your ancestry. Turn on the bell so you don't miss what's coming next, because the journey ahead will pull you even further from the surface and closer to the essence. And I want you to comment below, I reached the end because my soul needed more. Write it exactly like that. Those words will unite us, showing who among us is truly walking this path in both body and spirit. If this message stirred something deep inside you, if it awakened memories or emotions you can't quite name, then tap the like button now, because that simple act helps this message find others who are also searching for light in the darkness. But don't stop here. No, the journey continues. The next video you see on the screen completes the revelation we began today. Click it, keep going. Your spirit will thank you for not stopping at the surface, for daring to dive into the truth that waits below.